Democrats are understandably worried about Joe Biden because his approval rating remains low and he has been unable to do much about the various things that have been happening in the political landscape over the last year, namely the Roe v. Wade debacle, inflation, the gun issue, and so on. However, when it comes to the astrology, I remain hopeful, even as I admit that this is really putting astrology to the test, because should there be a really bad outcome in the 2022 elections in November, and to be quite honest, even the loss of one of the chambers in the 2022 elections would be very problematic for Joe Biden as well as the Democratic Party. And so when we look at the astrology in terms of explaining why he's had such a hard time, it's Saturn, 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 because Saturn has been in Aquarius since he assumed the presidency, and the square to Mars, which it did for the most part in 2021 and into early 2022, while simultaneously opposing the Pluto, that totally explains the difficulties in the early part of his presidency, especially when things really went south in Afghanistan. However, I had been more hopeful that the Saturn squared to Mercury, which is what he's been dealing with this year, would have been easier. And the fact is it hasn't been. My argument was that since Jupiter trines Mercury, Mercury would be more protected. But the bottom line is Saturn is a very difficult planet and tends to be even more difficult if a person is in a high-level position, like the presidency, obviously. And so, in that sense, the problems have continued. And yet, if we look ahead, and that's how astrology works, you always look to see where things are going, you notice that the October to December period features a really powerful Jupiter station in late Pisces. I've mentioned this numerous times. I remember first bringing it up in the summer of 2021 as being something that correlates with a very happy period in a person's life. You'd be trining his Sun and Venus, and it's the kind of thing that far more often than not, if not perhaps every single time, correlates with victorious outcomes, which would contradict the notion of negative events around that time, which is the time of the election. And furthermore, you also know that Saturn remains in Aquarius until the spring of 23, and you know that as we get into 23 in the spring, it's going to be in Pisces for several years. And Pisces is a much better sign for Joe than Aquarius, because Pisces makes a trine to all these Scorpio planets. And that's something that when you look forward in terms of the horizon, you'd have to say things would get easier, not harder. And then finally, the Neptune transit, which is in the late degrees of Pisces, is also very positive, because a planet like Neptune at moments of challenge always seems to come through in terms of your popularity holding up well enough to keep you in good shape. So bottom line, although I realize that there is cause for concern, there's no doubt, nevertheless, I would still remain hopeful, even while finishing this video and admitting that this situation is definitely putting astrology to the test.